I walked into the boardroom and spotted two familiar faces frozen in shock. The hum of the projector filled the room as I pulled out the cold leather chair at the head of the table. They whispered to each other, their eyes darting toward me, trying to process what they were seeing. It took them a moment to gather the courage to speak. "Is it really you?" one stammered. Their faces drained of color before they could look away. Yes, it was me, but not the version they remembered bullying in the school hallways. Now, I was their boss. I'd spent a decade building every skill they once mocked me for. Now it all led to this. But before any of this was possible, there was a time when I felt like I didn't belong anywhere. The roots of my journey run deep in the kind of pain that doesn't leave visible scars. It wasn't just the names or the pranks. It was the way their laughter trailed behind me, echoing through the halls and settling into the pit of my stomach. There's a particular humiliation that comes from being targeted in front of everyone, and it sticks. I remember one morning in the cafeteria, sitting alone and trying to disappear into my book. One of them snatched my tray and dumped my lunch onto the floor for everyone to see. The others watched, more entertained than surprised, while I crouched down to pick up the mess. The janitor's pitying look was almost worse than the laughter. Later that day in gym class, while I tied my shoes at the edge of the court, someone hurled a ball at my back hard enough to knock me forward. Their laughter was sharp and loud, and no one stepped in. Not the coach, not my classmates. In those moments, I felt exposed and powerless, like I existed only as a punchline. No one intervened. Teachers shrugged it off. My parents told me to toughen up. And I learned early that standing alone meant staying invisible. Even the kids who floated on the margins with me did their best to blend in, careful not to attract attention. I understood their silence, but it added a new layer to the isolation. When you're ignored or humiliated at every turn, you start to wonder if maybe there's something about you that deserves it. I spent nights replaying scenes in my head, searching for some way I could have changed the outcome, but all I found was the same ache in my chest. There's a way bullying seeps into the way you see yourself. The more it happened, the more I started to believe their version of me. I kept my head down and tried to make myself as small as possible, hoping if I didn't make noise, they'd leave me alone. But shrinking didn't make me invisible. It just made me an easier target. The shame was constant, and it followed me everywhere. Still, underneath all that, something stubborn refused to give in. I wasn't angry, not really. It was more like a quiet determination to prove I was more than what they saw. If I couldn't beat them at their own games, I'd find another way to win. I threw myself into schoolwork where their opinions didn't matter. Every time I brought home an A, it felt like a small victory no one could take away. While they joked around and skipped assignments, I focused on building something for myself, piece by piece. My escape plan became an obsession. I spent hours in the library, reading about colleges and careers that could take me far from that town. I daydreamed about a future where I was known for what I could do, not for what I lacked. It wasn't about revenge, not then at least. It was about survival, about finding a way to exist on my own terms. The hardest part was carrying that weight alone. I learned to move through the world with my guard up, always waiting for the next comment or prank. But over time, the constant pressure forged something in me I didn't recognize at first. A kind of quiet resilience. I stopped looking for validation from the people around me and started measuring myself by my own standards. I held on to the idea that if I could just get through it, I could build a life where their voices didn't matter. But somewhere under those insults, I found a quiet spark. Maybe survival meant outlasting them. That thought was enough to keep me moving forward, even when it felt impossible. I didn't know it then. But that stubborn streak would become the foundation for everything that came next. Change didn't come overnight. The shift from outcast to authority happened in small, sometimes invisible ways. When I left high school, I stepped into college carrying all the old doubts with me. My first week on campus, I stood in line at orientation, clutching a campus map, sure that everyone else belonged more than I did. That feeling followed me into my first internship, where I kept my head down, convinced I'd been hired by mistake. I'd nod along in meetings, barely speaking, afraid of confirming I didn't deserve a seat at the table. The turning point came from someone who didn't coddle me. Anne, a coworker, pulled me aside after a meeting. "You've got good ideas," she said, "but no one's going to know unless you speak up." She didn't sugarcoat it. It stung a little, but it also made sense. I started contributing, quietly at first, but enough to notice people paying attention. That was the first time I realized I could change how people saw me just by showing up differently. College became my training ground. Every A, every answered question in study groups, every nod from a professor chipped away at my doubt. I learned that stepping up, even when I was nervous, made the next step easier. I joined clubs, took on group projects, and forced myself to network, even when it felt unnatural. I still felt like an outsider sometimes, but I could see myself growing more capable with each new challenge. After graduation, I landed an entry-level job at a mid-sized company. The work was tedious: spreadsheets, admin, late nights. But I treated every task as a chance to prove myself. If I couldn't be the most experienced person in the room, I'd be the most reliable. Over time, people noticed. My manager started trusting me with tougher assignments. Coworkers asked for my input. Each small win felt like another brick in the foundation I was building. Eventually, I got the chance to lead a team project. I spent a week before the kickoff obsessing over every detail, worried about failing in front of everyone. The old insecurity crept in. What if I couldn't handle it? What if my team didn't respect me? But I prepared for every meeting, listened more than I talked, and made sure everyone's voice was heard. The project didn't just meet its goals, it exceeded them. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was faking it. I started to believe I belonged. I realized that my hardships weren't holding me back. They were my secret advantage. The years of being overlooked had taught me to listen, to observe, to work harder than anyone expected. I wasn't loud or flashy, but I was steady. People started to trust me to get things done. Momentum built slowly. Promotions came, not because I was the most charismatic, but because I was consistent and dependable. I still thought about those early days. The cafeteria, the locker room, the feeling of being invisible. But now, those memories pushed me forward instead of holding me down. But would all this hard work ever pay off? That question hung over me, even as I racked up small wins and positive feedback. Then, one afternoon, I got an email from my boss asking me to come to his office. My first instinct was worry. Old habits die hard. But when I sat down, he handed me a letter. My name was next to the word manager. He said, "You earned this. Your team notices how hard you work, even when you think they don't." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. That moment wasn't just about the title. It was about finally feeling seen for who I'd become, not who I'd been. The new role brought its own challenges. I was responsible for people, decisions, outcomes, but I didn't lose myself in the process. I remembered what it felt like to be overlooked, and I made sure no one on my team felt that way. I kept my approach quiet, but firm. Authority didn't mean being the loudest voice in the room. It meant being the one people could count on. That's how I found myself walking into that boardroom one Monday morning, ready to lead a meeting. I didn't expect anything unusual, but as I took my seat at the head of the table, I noticed two faces I hadn't seen in years. The recognition was instant. Their eyes met mine, and for a brief moment, the room seemed to freeze. There's a certain weight that settles in a room when you realize the people sitting across from you once made it their mission to break you. I held their gaze for a second longer, watching the flicker of recognition in Mark's eyes before he looked away. They weren't expecting to see me here, not like this, and I could see them scrambling to adjust. Mark leaned toward Ryan, whispering something behind a hand, but their discomfort was obvious to anyone paying attention. Over nearly a decade, I moved from spreadsheets to strategy sessions, each promotion earning me more authority. My job had become less about proving myself to others and more about setting the tone for my team. Still, seeing Mark and Ryan on the other side of the table pulled me back to memories I hadn't thought about in years. They looked older, a little worn down, but the way they shrank into their seats felt familiar. I introduced myself, keeping my voice steady and professional. Mark's response was a little too formal, his handshake too quick. Ryan just nodded, his expression tight. I could sense their unease as they settled into their seats, putting as much distance between us as they could without making it obvious. The meeting itself was routine. I went through the agenda, answered questions, and assigned tasks. But every so often, I'd catch Mark fiddling with his pen or Ryan glancing at the clock, both of them clearly distracted. It was almost like they were waiting for the ground to give way beneath them. I remembered how I used to feel in their presence, always bracing for the next jab, trying to stay invisible. Now, the roles had completely reversed. They were the ones hoping not to be noticed, careful not to draw my attention. What struck me most was my own reaction. I'd always imagined that if I ever faced them again, I'd want to make them pay for what they'd done. But sitting there, in charge and unshaken, I realized I didn't need to. In that moment, I realized the greatest victory wasn't crushing them. It was knowing they'd never break me again. My restraint wasn't weakness. It was proof of how far I'd come. After the meeting, Mark approached me about a deliverable his team was behind on. He adjusted his tie and stammered, "We're working on it. It's just been a crazy week." He shot Ryan a look, maybe hoping for backup, but Ryan stayed quiet. I kept my answer simple. "That sounds challenging, but we expect results, not excuses. I trust you'll handle it." I watched them shrink back as I walked away. No need for theatrics. The power dynamic had shifted, and they felt it. Another time, Ryan mishandled an important document, and I had to address it in front of the group. He fumbled for words, cheeks flushed. "I'll correct that right away," he managed. I nodded, giving nothing away. There was no satisfaction in belittling him. Just watching him worry about my response was enough. I didn't need to say anything more. Neither of them ever brought up our shared past. There was never an apology, no awkward attempt at conversation about high school. They both knew who I was, but they also knew the rules had changed. I could have forced the issue, demanded an explanation, but I didn't see the point. Their discomfort was enough. I had nothing to prove. If anything, I found a strange sense of closure in the silence between us. They couldn't undo what they'd done, and I didn't need them to. My presence, calm, competent, and unbothered, was the only answer I needed to give. The real satisfaction came from knowing that I'd built something for myself, something they could never take away or diminish. The urge to retaliate faded quickly. I didn't want to become the kind of person who used power to settle old scores. Instead, I focused on leading my team, making sure no one else felt the way I once did. That was the real reversal. Not just holding authority, but using it differently than they ever had. Looking back, I realized that the boardroom wasn't about revenge. It was about showing them, and myself, that I'd moved on. I could be in the same room, hold all the cards, and still choose not to play their game. That was the real victory, and as the meeting ended and everyone filed out, I felt lighter than I had in years, ready to let the past stay where it belonged. The real victory wasn't about making anyone feel small. It was showing what's possible when you turn pain into purpose. Sitting at that table, confident and composed, I saw clearly. Their approval or regret meant nothing. The power they once held was gone, replaced by my own sense of direction. My success was the only closure I needed. If you've ever felt powerless, share your story in the comments. Your journey could inspire someone else. And next time you walk into a room, remember, you might just be sitting at the head of the table,